because there's no reason why anyone should be making millions of dollars, big money kahuna bucks, while kids on reservations are going hungry, while education is being funded 30% less, while clean water resources are being funded 30% less, and while the government is still taking land away from native reserves. If that is still happening,
like, I was just so very impressed. That was over the span, I think, of maybe 2-3 minutes, and that's what it took. That's what it took for someone who is incredibly articulate and well-versed on the subject to explain it in a way that has a resounding effect upon the audience watching it. Nodders, pay up, based, extremely based, nodders. Talk a little bit about LANDBACK, because I thought this was a very good description of it.
Yeah, would you like to introduce yourself to the class? It's a large and invisible classroom, but it is there.
Yeah, for sure. So my name is Morgan Kikashange. I am an Anishinaabe Ojibwe living in Southern Ontario. I am a full status Indian under the Indian Act of Canada, which means I have any and all rights associated with being a full status Indigenous persons in Canada. And just to give a bit of background context, one of the reasons why I felt like I might be able to opine on the discussion that we're going to have is because my reservation actually has received a parcel of land back from the federal.
Very, very. This is a great introduction. I've watched this already, but I wanted to show parts of it to all of you. But this is, in my opinion, I mean, just a pitch perfect description of LANDBACK and LANDBACK issues right out of the gates. It then goes into some other very complex issues involving different systems of oppression between different ethnicities and races, and obviously we'll do a little bit of a dissection of that. And also I would like to bring attention to what Kubi has pointed out, in that Chico is now forming a perfect hot dog for Halloween in the corner there. So there we have it.
Federal government, as well as paid out a chunk of restitutions that went along with that. So that's about it. That's who I am.
Nice. That slaps. My chat humbly asks your pronouns.
Yeah, blood
out of respect.
She, her, or they, them is fine.
Okay. There you go, chat. We got... You can quit spamming it. Awesome. Okay. So I'll just say that I appreciated your email. Usually when I have conversations on issues like these, I'm talking to people who aren't really directly affected by that stuff, or whose investment in it is kind of an abstract intellectual or ethical concern rather than something more immediate. And
yes,
I thought the conversation that I had with Professor Flowers was really unproductive for a few reasons. I'm sure you're familiar with at least most of them.
Yes.
Right. It's the thing that bothered me the most is that I feel like sometimes the loudest advocates for Indigenous issues online are also the worst and like most disingenuous ones. Where
absolutely.
Where Indigenous issues are like, because you'll have to forgive the internet terminology, but it's like, it feels like a very virtue signaling thing sometimes to be very in favor of decolonization. Like, yeah, pro land back. But then when it actually comes to talking about these issues and actually like reconciling, like sometimes it can get, I think, a little bit, well, there's a clear dissonance. So that's my feeling on it. But like, what's your impression of all that?
So I tend to think about it in two types of ways. I try to give people the benefit of the doubt as often as I can by thinking, okay, maybe it's just that they haven't, spent the time necessary to get everything together, and maybe they're just struggling with articulating the cause appropriately and that sort of thing. But every now and then you do meet people who say, or who do things like they are trying to use talking points about Indigenous authority, actualization, land back movements, all of these sort of things, not because they're banking on the knowledge that the general public is going to be just as ill-informed as they are. And so they're kind of betting on this, like especially between the debate between Professor Flowers and Dr. Heemdout was where I noticed that Dr. Heemdout as an immigrant was somebody that was less informed than probably the majority of people who were, I think he's from Canada, right?
Dr. Heemdout?
I can't remember. Yeah.
I believe so.
But let's say he's from Canada. And so if he's immigrated here, there's a chance that his social circles and the way that, you know, our social structures kind of section us off, he's just not going to be as well informed in talking points about Indigenous land back movements. He's just not going to have the same kind of background knowledge on that as an actual Indigenous person might. And there's a chance, I don't want to say that this is how it was, but there's a chance that Professor Flowers knows that and is using those talking points because she knows that people aren't going to be able to call her out on it. Now, I don't know if that's actually what she did. I actually think she was probably just not as informed as she could have been and was just kind of stumbling over the right articulations. And one of the ways that I saw that was when Dr. Heemdout had said, well, you know, I'm an immigrant and I believe that everybody has a right to live where they live, which is an idea that I agree with. And so he says, well, why can't I just live where I live? And Professor Flowers says, well, because you're living on stolen land and that land is still stolen. And that's also true. And both of these opinions are valid opinions to have, but neither of them fully encapsulate the nuance of what it is to be an Indigenous person repping the land back movement.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, that's a great base to start with. Before we continue, though, I just have to ask. There's a bit of odd feedback coming from your microphone, almost like
difficulties. But one of the things that I noticed right out of the gates is that there's going to be a handful of things said during the course of this conversation that, on the surface, right away would be something that I think would deeply upset somebody who isn't either as well versed in these issues as Morgan is, or would simply take offense to the way that they're presented, say by Vaush, rather than continuing the conversation along the path that Morgan takes it. Now, when people ask me, and this was kind of my reason for calling into Dr. Heemdout's show to talk about land back after I'd listened to him and Professor Flowers talk about it, and why some people ask me, why don't you consistently use terms like settler, colonizer? Why don't you refer to them as always living on stolen land? Why don't you say that the blood of their ancestors is upon them, or things of this nature? Because to me, that always shuts down discourse. It shuts down discourse very rapidly, especially if you're talking to someone who isn't even already open to these ideas in the first place. If you come at this from I'm going to describe this to you, and this is something that I think you will find fair, okay? These are agreements that were made upon between people who arrived into this country, you can call them settlers, and the people who were indigenous to this land. These agreements were broken by the people who had made them, and they continued to enact things like, I'm sure you already know about this and probably agreed that it happened, genocide, as well as a whole bunch of other horrifying events. So, in the event of land back, what they're trying to do is honor the original treaties as well as seek out crown-owned land, as in land owned technically by the Queen, because the stewards of that land to this point have not been great, whereas Indigenous people seem to do much better jobs at, say, protecting land, whether it's public land, crown land in this case, large, vast swaths of land. Land, by the way, in many instances of which there's no general interest to Canadians outside of just its majestic beauty, but a lot of interest to corporations. To companies, there's a whole bunch of mining minerals to be had there. There's a whole bunch of pipeline to be laid through there. So, yes, I think it would be in the best interest of people who are looking to sustain the human race, as in stop us from being completely devoured by corporate interests trying to mine and extract all of our valuable resources, to give that land to the Indigenous people of whom it belonged originally, and also because they are better stewards of that land in terms of defending it. Like, all of that is very different than being like, you're a goddamn colonizer. You're a colonizer and y'all gotta get out. You gotta get out and go back to Europe. Every single one of you. Like, in the case of certain land-back settlements, say like the Squamish Nation, right? People already live there. There's already a whole bunch of people living there. And Indigenous people have no interest in kicking people out of their homes, evicting them from their apartments, or even kicking them out of their houses and their with backyards and saying, hey, go find somewhere else to live. We got this. It's ours now. What's ours is ours. You've had it for too long. That's kind of people stuck in, I'm sorry, but like the colonial mindset. The idea that, we enacted imperialism and then colonization thereafter upon this area. So naturally, if you're given the land back, you're going to do the same thing right back to us. And then what do we do? Because, where are we going to go next? Whereas that is not the case at all. Like, if land back is being framed that way, or being framed in the way that the new national socialists on the internet, the patriotic socialists like to frame it, is that it's some kind of bougie Jeff Bezos funded NGO or something. That is not true either. That is like treating all Indigenous people and Indigenous movements as a giant monolith. One huge monolith that apparently, because one group got funding from Jeff Bezos, Bezos means that all land back movements are therefore corrupted by the bourgeois natives, as they call them. In the US, there were, I think, multiple treaties that were successfully torn up. You mentioned land back is about honoring treaties. Is which one handled on a case-by-case, nation-by-nation basis? It's absolutely handled by a case-by-case basis. In Canada, there has been victories in the courts. I usually bring up the Squamish Nation as one. She's going to bring up another one. She's actually someone who lives in a band who has won land back, and she'll explain why and what happened in that settlement. But again, yeah, the idea of treating every single case is the same, every single Indigenous person is the same. These are completely you got to kind of take yourself out of that monolith idea.
It feels like, we had a great number of native tribes that the U.S. government lied to. We made contracts with them, and then we broke them, for the funsies of it. And the reservations we have now are like a shadow of a ghost of what their allotments were supposed to be. So when I think of land back, I think of fulfilling the legal obligations we set out as a baseline for addressing the inequality that centuries of colonization and genocide have entrenched. There are some things that I think are agreeable and some I don't. I do know there are people who make the argument, though I've never actually heard this from an Indigenous person, that Native people have the right to take back over the United States, and that lefties should advocate for that, and that if you're white, you should go back to Europe. Now, I do not think that's representative of what most advocates for Indigenous issues want, in part because it's very, very dumb, and I don't think that little of them. At least I think it's dumb. And also because it strikes me as sort of the logic of ethno-nationalism crammed into a more socially acceptable context. That's the stuff
I agree.
I tend to fight against, but I'm really amicable to other potential solutions. So when you think of land back in, I guess in Canada or wherever you think it's applicable, what do you think of?
So I'll use my perspective with my reservation actually being given a parcel of land back from the federal government as a thoroughway here. So land back to me, my parcel of land that was redistributed back to my band and my reservation is a huge area. It was enormous. And part of that area includes cities. It includes cities that have already been developed, that have already got infrastructure, that already have buildings and high schools and colleges and hospitals and yada, 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 yada. And so there's no way for us to, move in and say, you guys all have to leave now because this is on, technically, our land, So that just isn't, first of all, it doesn't make sense. It just doesn't make sense to waste the time and effort and manpower that it would take to try and articulate something like that. First of all, I don't think any reservation has the actual power to do that. And second of all, I don't think people want to. What we prefer is that in that parcel of land, there should be a pecking order for who gets access to the resources of that land first. So if that land now belongs to us legally, there should be no reason why anybody else gets to go onto that land and start chopping down trees, start building roads, unless we say so. And if they do want to do that without our say so, then what they have to do is pay restitutions. So it's a double-sided issue. Part of the land back movement is getting access to land that hasn't been developed and taxing land that has been developed. If you're going to use resources from the land, if you're going to develop infrastructure on the land, and you're going to benefit from that, there's no reason why Indigenous people, 20, 30, 40 minutes away from those cities shouldn't be receiving some sort of taxation from those resources, from the money that's made in selling and buying those resources, from the income that's generated. There shouldn't be any reason why taxes can't be made for us to benefit from also, so that we can be equal on an equal platform.
Can I add to that really quick?
Yeah, absolutely.
I just want to say that in the U.S., I know that with regards to resource extraction, there are huge tracts of federal land out west, not so much east, but west, where we mine oil or we sell the rights to lumber, stuff like that. And I've heard that too, that there are areas where companies are given the right by the federal government to just essentially take what they want. And natives, right, they've said okay, this land was ours before, and it should be ours again. And the first thing we're doing is making you motherfuckers pay. You're going to pay us out the nose.
That's right. If you want to take the land, if you really want it that bad, you're going to pay us out, and you're going to pay us out big time, and you're going to pay us out for as long as you're using it. Because there's no reason why anyone should be making millions of dollars, big money, kahuna bucks, while kids on reservations are going hungry, while education is being funded 30% less, while clean water resources are being funded 30% less, and while the government is still taking land away from native reserves. If that is still happening,
I was just so very impressed. That was over the span, I think, of maybe 2-3 minutes, and that's what it took That's what it took for someone who is incredibly articulate and well-versed on the subject to explain it in a way that has a resounding effect upon the audience watching it. Nodders, pay up, based, extremely based, nodders. And this to me is honestly something that's incredibly important. I know people don't think about like online communities, messaging, when it comes to the way people interact with each other, either through Twitch or YouTube or all this kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, 5,000 people watching that. Many of them could be young, many of them could be Zoomers. I don't have the stats on Vaush's audience. If they're going to walk away from a discussion on LANDBACK and overwhelmingly then go home to their friends or whatever else they're going to do, or go back to in the classroom, school, and start talking about LANDBACK, and all they've learned and their takeaway from it is LANDBACK equals white genocide. It's the same thing. It's an ethno-state. And then that idea spreads, right? 5,000 people then have this idea implanted in their heads, and they go out and they tell their friends, and their friends tell their friends, and more people keep to perpetuate a false narrative, which is not true. That has nothing to do with LANDBACK. Whereas this person comes on, explains it perfectly, articulately, and then all of a sudden, everyone, because it does seem like an incredibly reasonable idea when you don't present it as something as being like, I think there's a problem and disconnect, especially maybe with North Americans who aren't familiar with indigenous culture, stuff like that, to think that this has some kind of like, well, this is a war that we're at, and once they get this land back, they're either going to kick us out, or they're going to claim that they have even more land that's theirs. And then when does this end? And is LANDBACK going to be going on forever until basically the indigenous population owns all of North America? Or even worse, is it something to do with like their connection, their spirituality, and their connection with the earth, and like, you know, all this kind of stuff? I can't wrap my head around that, not with my Eurocentric version of, you know, Christianity and what religion should be. So I'm just going to say that's weird as well. No, I don't want any of this. Like, at the end of the day, it's way more important to me for people to understand both what LANDBACK is about, and if you are on the left side of the spectrum, to understand why it's so crucially important to support something like this, because it will benefit you. It benefits non-Indigenous people as well. And yeah, I was so relieved to hear her come on the show, express it in that way, and also get such like a warm reception. To like it was one of the more, I think, productive moments for furthering both Indigenous causes and leftist causes in terms of this discussion, which has just gone all over the map for so long in so many different directions.
Happening. There's no good reason why we shouldn't be getting ours first, you know? But 100%. To suggest that that means we go into cities where people live already and have already, you know, like some people have been living in cities for generations. It doesn't make any sense to go into a developed city and say, all of you get out. How does that make sense? It just doesn't make sense to me. And I see there's so many people that will use that. They'll use the land back movement to do.
Well, Callus, there's a difference between people who acknowledge, because Canada does this. It's the most wonderful Canadian hypocrisy, acknowledging that we are on unceded territory. Like, that's done all the time. It's done in the theaters here. It's done in the plays. It's done even when you're in the gondola on your way to go skiing. Like, on the gondola ride itself, if you go to Grouse Mountain, they'll tell you in the speech, like, we just like to first honor the fact that we are on the unceded territory. That's what they always say. Simply stating out loud that you are on unceded territory does nothing for the material conditions of Indigenous people.
Be like, well, they should be allowed to say if they want to do it. And I'm like, yeah, sure, maybe technically, but can you not see the harm and the detriment in suggesting that Indigenous people should be allowed to do a genocide? Like,
there's a term for that, right? So this is like a racist conspiracy theory, kind of, the fear of retribution. And it has a million like invocations, but generally it's the idea that like, if we gave power to this minority group. So step one is denying the idea that the minority was ever mistreated. Step two is when it looks like they might get equal rights, you say, okay, we totally mistreated them. And also they're going to do it to us just as bad. They're going to do it to us worse if they get the power too. So we can't let them have that power. And I feel like, so obviously a lot of very racist groups have said that. I disagree with that.
Well,
but sometimes I get the feeling there are people online who will invoke the fear of retribution as a positive. Like, yes, they will do this, and you should be thankful that you get to participate in their retribution. Like, oh, wow, okay.
I think it's coming from just a similar place of ignorance, actually, and not in a cruel kind of way. I think it's just honestly that people are so uninformed about how Indigenous people think about land, about the land back movement. I think that, you know, especially on the rad left side, you'll find people who will say like, you know, a lot of crazy stuff like that. And you say, okay, that's great and all, but like, do you know what you're talking about? do you really know what you're talking about? Going onto Twitter and like asking 3 or 4 people if they should or should not be allowed to do something is not the way to turn this conversation. The way to turn this conversation is, like you're doing here, is including Indigenous voices in the rhetoric and allowing us the opportunity to. It's not that people are getting it so wrong. It's just we need to smooth some wrinkles out so that people don't start
I'll disagree with that.
using really
I think people are getting it
inflammatory
so
language
wrong.
to describe how.
But like I'm not sure if everyone was here when I had that talk with, or I don't know what you want to call it, mini debate with Dr. Heemt about LANDBACK. But again, within maybe 20 minutes of talking to him, he was like, oh, that's totally reasonable. Yeah, I would support that. It's just the way that it was worded to me. It sounded as if like I, as an immigrant who lives in this country, I'm not welcome because I'm like literally living on stolen land and I have to give up wherever I live at any given time. And like if that was genuinely what LANDBACK was saying to every single person who lived in Canada, yeah, I can understand why people hear that and they're like, yeah, no, I don't support that. This is, come on. At some point we have to accept that colonization happened and they have to get with the program. That's all I'm going to say. Like it's so much more beneficial to have people be like, oh, that it's so reasonable. Okay, this is not a radical idea like I was sold, or this is not something involving the bourgeois indigenous capitalists like the rad left is selling it as well. Man Cramps, thank you so much for the Prime and the message Beezy Bucks. I appreciate it. Ahim, changed his position on it by the time we were done that conversation.
We feel about our own problems.
Yeah, in a way, it reminds me a lot of I know these aren't perfectly like parallel, but back during the Black Lives Matter protests here in the US, when they were at their peak at least, there was this weird disconnect where the movement is ostensibly about the interests and the rights of black people and their treatment by the police and other issues. But there were people on the far left who were saying like, yeah, that's step one, but we also need socialism. And they would try to put that into the movements. And look, I'm a socialist. I agree with the message, but it felt like it was being used as a vehicle sometimes for other issues, which seems to me to be like essentially the opposite of what's repeated almost like dogma on the left, which is listen to the oppressed. Sometimes it feels like by listen to the oppressed, they mean listen to the oppressed people who agree with us and ignore the ones who don't. And I know, and I've seen that, like, I've seen that in, like, sometimes with the black community, like, sometimes black people who have more moderate voices will get shouted down by the more radical ones. And while I like the discourse, I don't like the constant, almost like oppression Olympics, where it's like...
It's hard to come into a scenario where, when you're on the left side, you're already dealing with the right. You're already dealing with people who just, first of all, they hate you. They don't want to give you the time of day to begin with. And to have then to also be incorporating infighting in your rhetoric, having to manage that because some people on the left think that you'll never be left enough is really frustrating. And I hate it. I hate it so much.
I imagine.
And like there are elements of that. So there is this kind of strange mysticism that's done by liberals, especially. I would be pointing the finger more at liberals than I would at leftists, but leftists do it too, of either indigenous people being kind of like mystic creatures almost, that are just in tune with nature and they can all speak to spirits and other stuff like that, instead of treating them as human beings in this case, because this is, at the end of the day, a very material request. It's saying that this is in fact land that we both owned and were agreed upon to be sovereign upon this land, as the treaties that were signed originally. So there is a problem with that. There absolutely is, and it's a problem that is prevalent both in liberal circles and leftist circles. And it does cloud discourse as well. It can make things more difficult, especially for indigenous people. Like basically, the lesson in all this is that if you are a Twitter account and you happen to be, let's say, a white leftist living in, I don't know, San Francisco or San Diego, in a nice apartment, and you've got an incredible Twitter profile, you've got a couple thousand followers, using your voice on Twitter to constantly vilify anyone who tries to talk about these subjects, as in, shut up, colonizer, return to Europe, shut up, filthy colonizer, the blood of the colonizers is upon you, colonizer, the settlers and colonizers, every single one of you, check your privileges, things like that. It's not effectively turning people onto these issues as in, this seems like a topic that I would like to engage in now. I'd like to learn more about LANDBACK and speak to you about it. That's not going to be the response that comes from the everyday person. And in turn, that is most likely going to hurt the movement as a whole, because people are going to come back from that being like, well, yeah, but the people who I thought were supposed to be vocal supporters of LANDBACK have been screaming at me and calling me a genocidal maniac all day. Well, like, is that the official position of LANDBACK? What are we talking about here?
Imagine that must be incredibly frustrating. I want to know, by the way, in case I can find a map, you described a big land back gain that was received recently. Is there a name associated with it that I could look up?
So I don't know if I can't remember what it's called, but my reservation or my band, you'll probably be able to find it better that way, is Whitefish River First Nation. So they encapsulate a few different reserves, including mine, and mine is I think one of the anchor style reserves.
Gotcha. That's a pretty logo. When I was in university in Northern California, I'm ashamed to admit that I don't remember details, including the names, but there were a few really prominent indigenous groups in that area because Washington does have, there's a good bit of land there committed to that. And sometimes they would come to the university or I would talk with them, and I felt like their arguments were always really, really good. Like, I don't think I ever heard a bad one, but I never see those arguments thrown out in the public. It's always like the most milquetoast moderate bullshit, or it's such...
I would just like to say that when you go to the Whitefish River First Nation, of the topics, there's governance, economy, and cannabis is number 3. I like it. It's right on the front page. Governance vote. They're governed by an elected chief and councillors. Elections are held every 2 years and are conducted according to Section 74 of the Indian Act. The chief and each councillor holds an office for a term of 2 years, at which time elections are held to elect a new governing body. The number of citizens determines the number of council positions. In 1985, WRFN opted to use their own citizenship code, which sets out citizenship requirements. Interesting. The chieftain is elected and the councillors' elections are held every 4 years and are conducted according to the code. Neat.
Absurdly hyperbolic, like radical dogma that it's alienating to anyone outside of that like ideological block.
I think the reason why that happens is because, at least in my experience, whenever I'm talking about Indigenous issues with other Indigenous people, I notice that other Indigenous people tend to have this this sort of spiritual rhetoric that works hand in hand with their actual talking points. And so when you're not from that background, like if you're white especially, and you start to see, Native people, talking about the creator and talking about this stuff and that stuff, while they're also trying to teach you about movements like the land back movement, we especially lose the younger crowd. And so there's a lot of self-censorship that goes on to make ourselves more approachable and appealable to mainstream talking points.
Yeah, no.
It doesn't always happen, but it sometimes you can tell right away.
Well, I've seen that, right? Wasn't that kind of, I remember that being a big thing in the 70s, at least here in the United States.
Yeah.
I wasn't around back then, but I've heard it was like there was a wave of liberal sympathy for the plight of the Native American, but it was framed in this very weird, almost like noble savage.
That's correct.
They were closer to the land, like talking about like the native genocide, the same way you might talk about like a deforestation or a species of fish going extinct, where it's like the beauty of nature has been soiled. It's like, this, you might disagree with me on this, but from what I've read on the many, many native tribes here in the United States, I feel like a lot of the narrative of them being more in touch with nature and blah, 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 I feel like a lot of that, from what I've read, is horseshit. That they would... It
depends.
There were elements of it. Certainly, I mean, obviously the Europeans came over with a much more antagonistic attitude towards land ownership and stuff like that, but
what I would say is horseshit is the idea that like every single person in America who happens to be Indigenous or First Nations or whatever, that they are, well, sorry, not First Nations if it's America, but that they are going to be like a monolith when it comes to that, as in every single one of them is going to either feel that, every single one of them is going to be highly spiritual, or, instead of being a secularist, it's like anything else. It's like any population, it varies wildly.
Mythologized to these like near like deific, like almost like you guys are like dryads or like satyrs or so. We were like, and it's like, well, I've seen like these Twitter takes you wouldn't believe, like before Europeans, like there was no rape in the Americas. Like, what are you talking about? Like they never did war. What are you talking about? They're people.
We literally have songs and dances and drumming circles for warriors. One of the biggest things in Ojibwe culture is at the opening of every, I don't know if every powwow, but on the powwow on my reserve, we open with the song Ogichitakwe, which is the warrior woman. It's the warrior woman song. And in Ojibwe culture, we honor our women specifically. Like we're big on treating women and men as equals. And so we honor our women at the powwows by introducing them through song first, but it's warrior women. And we have this concept about like war is a pretty big like thing culturally for Indigenous communities. Like I don't know why anyone would think that we didn't have war. And also, you know, a lot of the core foundations in the way that America's legal
Voltaz, it makes total sense. It's easy to assume in the convotes or whether any Europeans have a right to live in America, which gets super fucked really quick. I think that's a big thing to clarify for a movement. I think it's the most important thing because that's the part that's been taken and weaponized, where people think like, well, they're advocating for ethno-nationalism, or they're just basically saying Europeans go back to Europe. And it could not be further from the truth. Like the example I pointed to before is the Squamish Nation, which won some of the most valuable land in Vancouver, beachfront property. You know, it's I can't even calculate how much value that would have for developers to be able to use it. And one of the initial things they did is that they said that they're going to use the undeveloped parts of it to build low-income and sustainable housing. I mean, there's no really such thing, but a lot of people got mad at me for pointing that out and saying like, so what? You're basically advocating for a whole bunch of indigenous landlords? Is that what you want, Lance? You want a whole bunch of landlords to pop up? And I said, well, that's already happening. You have to understand that there's already mass developments of condominiums all over Vancouver. The real estate bubble in Vancouver is one of the largest ones in the world. It usually trades places with a couple other places for like the top 3. So development is already happening. What you seem to have a problem with in this case is indigenous people doing it. And that's something you should probably reflect upon. Because that's the big difference here. They're not saying that they want anyone who lives in that area to get kicked out of their area. They're actually saying that they want to make the housing more affordable for people who want to live there and or need to live there at the same time.
Legal system is set up is based off of indigenous tribes managing war and how they managed each other's different parties and how people would be allowed to, if you were from this warring state and that warring clan, you would come together in one house and you would both be allowed a time.
Yeah, Avail, like one thing that would be, and I wish you'd pointed it out at a certain point, is just to bring up the fact that if you want to talk about stewards of any given like piece of land in basically the world right now, look at that National Geographic article which says that while they make up about 5 to 8% of the population globally, indigenous people are responsible for 80 to 85% of ecological conservation around the world. So that's definitely something that's a talking point that I like to use, just to be like, not only does this benefit indigenous people, not only is it the right thing to do, but it also ultimately will benefit non-indigenous people as well, because they're not the ones who are going to be exploiting every single last square inch of resources within their land in order to turn profit, as just has been the case globally.
Speak, and you would both be allowed an audience to air out your grievances, and that became one of the foundations of American law. And that happened because there was war. Like, it didn't happen because everybody liked each other all the time.
I think the big failing of that liberal sympathy that I was talking about was that it put a lot of Native people, I think, in a museum.
It infantilizes us.
Right, you're Disney,
infantilizes us.
Yeah, you're like a Disney trope. Yeah. It is, well, because people, real living, breathing people, are, in addition to being generally shitty at times, I think, political problems that have to be dealt with immediately. All people, any group, any ethnicity. But, mystical forest wisdom people, well, that's more of an abstract concept that isn't necessarily directly derivative of Native Americans. So you could go, it doesn't really have to.
It can be. I think the issue is that it can be, like especially amongst our elders, the way my elders speak, I don't know that they would be happy to have a political discussion like this, because it's just not conducive to their way of speech and their way of understanding it and their experience and perception of the world. And part of that perception is that very classically hokey pokey spirits and all this kind of stuff, rhetoric. Like, it does come up, and you see it less in young people because, we're going to scare you off if we do that. You're going to look at us like we're, first of all, like we're, a museum exhibit, because it's so difficult for modern society to take, spiritual dogmatism seriously, which is fair. I think that's reasonable for young people to, any person rather, to feel that way. But if our culture and our rights to land and our rights to our heritage are so closely intertwined with the way we perceive the world, I think, why is it so hard for everybody to kind of be okay with that? You don't do anything like that to Black people. You don't take, Black culture and say like, oh, yeah, we got to help, Black people. But if only they'd stop with the hokey pokey weirdness, and only if they'd stop listening to like rap music. Like, no, you don't say that. You accept that Black culture is what is defined by Black people. And the same needs to happen, I think, for Indigenous people in order for them to start getting comfortable enough to really opining on it.
So, okay, I think that's really interesting because I've gotten a little bit in trouble over this before, and I guess I want your opinion on it. So I would be one of those younger people who's very off-put by spirituality. I find those arguments unconvincing, and I think that if you start to factor in perspectives like that, then you start to talk about, like, okay, well, do the Israelis have a moral right to their territory because of their thousands of years old, story on this, that, or the other? And like, it circles back to a lot of stuff. And I know that there are arguments for land back, which have to do with like the inherent tie to the land that some native groups have.
That's
like
correct, yeah.
Now, I'll admit, I've never cared about any of these arguments. I do care about restitution, equality, righting of injustices, stuff like that. But for me, I've always been a little concerned that, and this could just be my biases, but that the advocacy for it along spiritual lines almost undercuts the real political project, because I think you can make a very, very strong secular argument for the land back that you advocated before. Not because, like, your spiritual tie to the land, but because it was your fucking land. I mean, you don't have to spiritually justify, like, theft as a concept. You can
That's
just...
right, yeah.
Right, yeah.
Yeah. So most people, I've noticed too, we're very happy to articulate the land back movement without involving the spiritual aspect of it, because it can be separated. But you'll notice that Indigenous people will have a lot more to say if they are given the opportunity to include some of those spiritual aspects in. It's the same as, like, if I'm not saying it's right, but it's the same as...
It is also case-by-case basis, because in the case of, say, the Wet'suwet'en people, it is incredibly important to discuss their attachment not only to the land, but also the giver of life, water itself, because that was one of the crucial aspects of that case when they, the federal government of Canada, the RCMP, were not respecting their sovereign control over that area. They wanted to run a pipeline through it, and the pipeline company was still advocating for the fact that, yes, this may damage your local water supply, but at the same time, we're going to provide you with some alternative sources of water. Like that... It adds to how egregious that truly is, right? Because you are not only taking away something that is material from them, but you're also taking away something that is spiritual as well. So it compounds the crimes against humanity, is what I should say.
As if you went into town and you burned down the church, right, that would make Christian people unhappy. And in the same way, when Indigenous people see the government stealing ceremonial grounds for fasting, for instance, like we have a fasting ground on my reservation, and if it came about, tomorrow that some company was going to bust in there and tear it apart, of course the right to keep the land because it's our land takes hold above anything else. But personally, knowing that they were attacking a spiritual monument to us is like extra salt in the wound. And I think it's hard for non-Indigenous people to engage in this conversation because we're so closely tied to our culture, knowing that it was that so much of it was eradicated and that we're scrambling so hard to just keep hold of what we can at this point, and doing a really great job of it and fighting the good fight. But that's a really hard sell to the secular world. It's a really hard sell to go to young people and say, like, yeah, you should do what Indigenous people tell you to do because they're on the red path. They're walking the path. They're doing the healing. They're doing the ceremonies and stuff like that. It's not an easy thing to do. But the reason it's also important is because our culture and our cultural practices are one of the few things in society that works conducively with Indigenous people to help them heal from intergenerational trauma. And being attached to those rhetorics and those teachings and those historical sites and those spiritual attitudes is helping our people more than any other service in Canada is.
Okay. I think that 2 points. I think that makes a lot of sense, Even if you were to speak of it explicitly in secular terms, when you're talking about restitution in like a court case for damages, sentimental value is one of those factors, right? I mean, even if you're talking about nothing religious or inherently culturally valuable, you could be talking about the value of like a piece of property that belonged to your great, this, that, or the other. Stuff like that is factored in even in secular cases. So it seems logical then that even if I don't buy the spiritual argument, the spiritual importance of the land or of other tangential stuff, you can recognize that no matter what. Like, because, like, for instance, if there was a court case and somebody had an heirloom from the 1700s, like, and they got really mad that it was lost or destroyed or stolen, I don't have to get why they cared about it to recognize that there's some special importance there that can be.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You don't have to understand it. You just have to respect it. If you don't have to believe in, the spiritual rhetoric and dogmatism that surrounds Indigenous cultures. But for Pete's sake, would it kill you to just be a little polite, if we want to talk about it?
I actually saw online, there was once, I don't know if it was real or not, a story of a parent saying that to punish their kid, they deleted a Minecraft world that their kid had
Oh
worked
my
on for a long
gosh.
time. Now,
I would kill my mom.
in an objective sense, that Minecraft world is literally worthless. But the internet went to an uproar, and clearly you understand why. So so if we can agree that the subjective value of a Minecraft world is worthy of an internet backlash, then I guess you can probably make a pretty strong argument for, I don't know, thousands and thousands of years of cultural heritage tied to the landmarks of the region that you
Yeah. I think it does play an interesting debate too, when you're talking, if you want to, bring what's happening with Israel and Palestine into it, it can be a slippery slope, right? It doesn't take much for things to get absolutely haywire right out of the bat. And I think that's one of the other reasons why the general public doesn't want to get too into talking about Native issues, because first of all, in North America, if you come here and you're here as a settler or even as an immigrant, there's this understanding that, you might own your house, you might rent an apartment, you might own your car, but you don't own the land. The land doesn't belong to you. And when we think about it in terms of, from that perspective of being a settler or an immigrant, the federal...
Sorry. Muted. Sorry. Did you ever comment on the Professor Flowers thing? And I said I did more than comment on the Professor Flowers thing. I called in to Dr. Show because I didn't want topics related to land back that were seemingly getting so distorted by the discourse to continue that way. It was, to me, having multiple people walking away from conversations thinking that land back is either something related to ethno-nationalism or some form of like white genocide or just some form of huge, human displacement, as in every single person needs to get out of the country. I was like, it's going to be a net negative to people understanding this topic, right? That's, again, why I was so refreshed to see someone like Morgan speak about this so eloquently. Like, it would have been very easy for her to dismiss immediately what Vaush just said as being incredibly offensive, that you would ever say something like that in relation to Minecraft. How could you bring that up? I'm trying to talk to you about my spirituality. And that could have just been a huge point of contention, conversation shut down, and then everyone goes about their day, right? Whereas, again, if it's something that has people who may be very, very strictly set in like a very secular perspective of the world, and I myself, am not religious in any way, shape, or form, as well as a younger generation who is into these kind of things, the way people attribute value to things that you may not understand, right? If that's just the metaphor that we're going to use, if we separate anything else from that, can I now use this as an opportunity to convince you otherwise, that there is value in respecting not only the land back movement, but in addition to that, the spiritual connection that Indigenous people feel to their land, which would just be another step on top of this, which I did not think would happen in this discourse on this, online scene, the Twitch scene, the YouTube scene, the Twitter scene. Like, those are very big asks. At the very least, I was like, okay, let's just start with people understanding what land back's about first, and then we can work on to other things. But I was wrong, because again, in this conversation, not only does she find a way to perfectly relate it to both Vaush and his audience, at the end of the talk, Vaush is like, I changed my position on that. I now understand the necessity to also associate the spirituality with the land back movement itself. Like, that is so much more valuable. That is so much more valuable. And not because it's valuable because Vaush had his mind changed, but because his audience will then in turn learn more from that. The thousands, again, of people who are watching this, it's great that Vaush will change his opinion on this, but it's also very valuable for every single person who's watching this to be able to then learn from that and go forth and keep spreading that kind of a message, because the net benefit will be that many more people, especially younger generations, will understand the necessity of land back, not just from the perspective of this is the right and just thing to do, but also because there's an importance, a specific importance to Indigenous people as well, on top of everything else. It's a good thing.
Federal government owns the land and uses it to put houses on top of it, and you can own the house. That's kind of the rhetoric. And so it's very, very difficult to try and opine on subjects about land when the opposing party...
Professor Flowers is absolutely not an ethno-nationalist. I'm not saying that Professor Flowers is an ethno-nationalist. I don't think Professor Flowers is an ethno-nationalist. I've never thought that. I think that many people walked away from some of those conversations perhaps believing that advocacy for land back or land back movements itself is not specifically maybe ethno-nationalism, but is certainly about the fact that every single settler has to get out. You're on stolen land. Settlers, leave your homes. You're on stolen land, which is not what land back is advocating for. If it was, it would have a much harder time. It already has an incredibly difficult time being understood in the mainstream. Yeah. No, I know. I'm just saying.
doesn't have the same history with land that you do. Like I used to struggle as a teenager trying to articulate to adults why we should keep our land. I have people say to me like, well, why don't you just move? Why don't you give it up? Why do you have to have the land? And it's because that land is tied to every aspect of our person in a way that settlers and immigrants don't have the capacity to do so because they don't own land. It would be the same as if you went to somebody's house that was there for generations and generations and you kicked the people in there out of it and said, this is our house now. And imagine how the degree of displacement that would cause, and I think people don't realize it's still happening. Even though our reservation received a huge parcel of land back, which is really fabulous, it wasn't more than 10 years ago that people were still stealing chunks of it away. We're still parceling it off into golf courses and making backdoor deals with, municipalities to get reelected as
like Palestine.
Chiefs or whatever, and using land as a bribe for that. Like that still happens. So I don't get the rhetoric where people. I don't know. I guess that's a different issue, but
well, it's all related, right? And I mean, I get that. And honestly, I think a lot of people, including myself, I'm always going to be averse to the spiritualism, but cultural sentimentality, I understand. I mean, imagine like Stonehenge for the English, or Taj Mahal, or even if you just want to talk about like just purely.
And a lot of people are talking about Cervantes too.
The Grand Canyon.
Oh my gosh, right?
This is it's like Americana.
That's a good one though, because that's actually let's get into that because that's actually a really interesting topic. Let's talk about Mount Rushmore. So
I've heard a controversy about that one.
Right. So Mount Rushmore was originally I'm sure it was a spiritual location at one point, but it was called something else. I think it was called the something grandfathers. We believe that mountains are quote unquote grandfathers, like metaphorically. Mm-hmm. So those are the oldest spirits that ever spirited, right? And so they're like very significant to us. Each mountain is very important.
Yeah, she's a very talented artist.
Importance on types of mountains. And then settlers came and carved a bunch of faces into them and then called those mountains theirs and completely erased any cultural history and significance that was had by Indigenous people for that location. And now there's a push, so I've heard, that people want to reclaim Mount Rushmore under the reservation, the band that previously it was associated to.
Six grandfathers, chat.
And I think that's a really interesting question because that falls into the line of like,
Lakota,
if
six grandfathers.
Indigenous people don't have the right to do a genocide, do we have a right to dismantle symbols of colonialism, even if they're long-standing beloved symbols?
I am totally on board with you ethically, but pragmatically, I think the American people would sooner vote to tactically nuclear strike every reservation in our borders than they would be willing to give up the Mount Rushmore. Look, if nothing else, it's
why it's so ugly.
Like condemnation of our creativity, because you referred to the mountains as grandfathers on their own, but we had to literally carve faces onto them like children to refer to them as our founding fathers. We're too literal. We had to the metaphor didn't work with us. Okay, we had to actually sit down there and physically carve them in.
Yeah.
I'm totally on board with the spirit and sentiment, though. I've always found, I swear to God, I'm not doing this to virtue signal. I think Mount Rushmore is really ugly. I have never cared about Mount Rushmore. It's not even that I hate the founding fathers or whatever. I mean, maybe I do, but for different reasons. I just think it's ugly. I just do not get the appeal. I don't know.
I do feel it's a little tacky.
It's tacky.
Wow, it actually was really cool. This is before the carvings. It was called the Six Grandfathers.
It's tacky.
It's a little tacky, right? Like I get that like Egypt has the pyramids and India has the Taj Mahal and like everybody's got their thing, and I guess America was like really excited about colonizing the whole of North America and really wanted to swing their dicks around. But come on, giant faces of old people.
I'm not saying this would have been any better for Indigenous people. I'm just saying like if you want to celebrate the ancestry of our country or heritage or whatever for however far back that goes, like employ some metaphor. What if they had carved the entire face of the mountain so that one half of it was rocky and craggy like normal, and the other half was just a reservation in shadow upon which like the outline of the American borders were traced, or something? I don't know.
Do you mean like in Fooly Cooley, how there's those giant irons that are always looming in the background, ready to iron over the world? Don't bring Fooly Cooley
up with me, okay? We already like you enough. You don't need to lead it in, okay? You've already won the crowd. You don't need to bring it home like that. I have no idea what that is.
But
yes, honestly, if they had just carved it into a gigantic ironing thing and been like, hey guys, in 100 years this anime will come out.
Oh, Fooly Cooley is an anime. Ah, gotcha. All right, we only have about 15 minutes before the movie's going to start. So a couple things I want to quickly add to this. and I guess I won't have time to get to them right now. They go into a discussion about Black Lives Matter, and specifically Black Lives Matter in Canada, which did become a very, very powerful movement here as well. I participated in 3 different Black Lives Matter rallies while they were going on. But she said at that same time, right before that happened, there was a lot of media attention and press looking at the horrors and atrocities that were happening to the Wet'suwet'en people, and all of a sudden the media fell completely silent on that and started discussing other things. Now, the one part about that I disagreed with Morgan on is that I think it's really difficult to frame these things in terms of like, we cannot ever say where the media is going to direct their concentrated attention until it does happen. And I don't think that there was a net negative to the Black population in any way, shape, or form by Canada becoming so heavily involved in the Black Lives Matter movement. And then to kind of like correlate those two, it gets very, very tricky. And I think there should be, and still isn't, or there should be a huge amount of attention that is still paid to the Wet'suwet'en crisis because it's still going on. And Canada just got a new Crown Indigenous minister who's just said outright that I don't believe him that he says he's necessarily going to make land back a priority, but B, as a clear-cut case example of that, he brought up the Wet'suwet'en by name, which is massive. Massive. That's a federal appointee, technically working on the behest of the Queen, who's saying out loud that yes, what the federal government has been doing in regards to their use of the RCMP in this area for the benefit of multinational corporations to extract resources is wrong. The Wet'suwet'en people do have a claim to their land that should be sovereign area, and if they do not want a water pipeline to be built through there, then I'm sorry, you can't do that. You can't, like, he didn't say all that. This is just me, Lance, adding way more to it. But just the fact that he labeled that as a clear-cut case of land back and not having been recognized is massive. It's absolutely massive. And I agree. We do need solidarity. Like, the thing is, there is obviously an oppression of people worldwide, and that goes beyond, you know, race and class. There's highly oppressed white people, you know, and then there's of course the atrocities that have been committed against Indigenous people, and they are in Canada by and far the most maltreated people, both in Canadian history and currently by our judicial system. That doesn't mean in any way, shape, or form that any other struggle is invalid or should not be part of a collective experience. The whole idea, of course, and I'm going to sound like a virtue signaling Disney cartoon here, well, maybe not Disney would probably have the opposite take, but is that it is about the liberations of all people. We're not free until we're all free, kind of thing.
There weren't any consequences to me failing either, so yeah, it's...
But that just goes to show that, you know, the relationship between our race as a people to our government as an institution is wildly
1920s and 30s,
from
I didn't
any
know that.
other class of race that is in North America right now. And so if you're going to come on to a show with a large audience and start using Indigenous talking points, there are some things you've got to be aware of that. You know, we don't have the privilege that, that for instance, Black communities do in calling ourselves or assigning ourselves to a group of people without interference from the government. And that plays into how we think about the land back movement. You know, that we share a relationship with the government that other people do not. So to come out here and be like, yeah, it's okay if they want a genocide. It's, first of all, it's...
And what she just said there, like what she just brought up, specific to Canada, is that Indigenous people are the only people who are actually codified into Canadian law as a form of property. If you want to learn more about that, watch the discussion I had with Breen Ouellette, because he's an Indigenous lawyer who explains it perfectly. But that is one of the reasons why it is so crucial for these issues to be spoken about correctly. Because again, it is of incredible value to have people walk away from it not thinking that this has anything to do with genocide or ethno-nationalism or stuff like that, but specifically that it has to do with, again, honoring treaties and a spiritual connection to the land.
It's a little insulting because our relationship with our government is a lot more nuanced than that, you know?
Do you... Well, I'm sure historically you would agree it was a genocide at the very least. Maybe.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, yeah. Just because I know some people are going to hear that differently. I think I've actually been moved over a little bit, you know, on two main things, I think. One of them is that I need to stop thinking of native spiritual ties to the land through a spiritual lens, which I will dismiss, always, and rather through a lens of cultural import, which we can apply in a secular sense, and we have a much more like broad respect for. And also the fact that even if I'm not Christian, I'm culturally Christian, which means that there are going to be elements of spirituality from native people that I might think is more like weird, or I might have less like immediate respect for than other religious groups that I'm more like familiar with or attached to. So even if I believe in Christianity as little as I believe in native stuff, which is true, I would still like she was right. If somebody said like amen before eating around me, like I wouldn't think about it. But if somebody did like a little native chant, then I probably would feel weird about it. Obviously, part of that is just familiarity, but that familiarity, if absent, can breed a kind of political disaffiliation that leads to systemic oppression. So it's something you at least...
She brought up a really good example early on, and it was very similar to what you just mentioned, where it was like, how weird would it be if someone before you said amen right before eating, and you'd probably be like, oh, not weird at all, you know? It'd be a little strange if it's like, you know, one of my friends who was never Christian before, but obviously a lot of these things, because we see everything from like a Eurocentric or a Western perspective, the things that are heavily normalized to us are things that are just already codified within our society, like, you know, the practices of Christianity. And then things that may seem strange or odd to us happen to be things that we're not familiar with: indigenous culture, indigenous spirituality. And that's why we'll be very ready to dismiss it. We'll just be like, well, okay, yeah, but they believe in spirit gods and that ravens are tricksters and things like that. That just sounds like hocus pocus to me. And that has a lot to do, obviously, with the fact that we are conditioned to this Eurocentric perspective. But it is important as well that people should respect people's cultures, spiritualities, religion, obviously, regardless of where it comes from, and understand that that aspect of it is important to Indigenous people as well when they're talking about aspects of land back. I don't know if I have time for much more. I just wanted to say I thought this was, to be honest, refreshing. I was really nervous going into it. And it's, if you want to watch the whole thing, they go into a lot more different topics and discuss this. But ultimately, what is and what always remains to be like the most important thing to me is that more people will become not just like apathetic, but on board with concepts like land back and decolonization. And they don't get too much into the second part of that, but it's of enormous benefit.
Do you enjoy the Serfs but prefer not to have to use your eyeballs? Many are saying this. Well, we've got the solution for you. It's the Serf Times in podcast form, available on most major podcasting networks now. If you enjoy it, please consider leaving a good review and feedback, because it really helps the show out, apparently, and it's free, just like the podcast.
To our gods, Xander Corvus and Peyton L. Just, we will build a ladder to heaven to deliver you the daily news. To our monarch, Tom Spiker, we are your most humble of clownish jesters. To our lords, Trevor R. and Alexander Thaler, you have our undying fealty. To our knights of the round table, Nate, that one guy, Hagbird Celine, Matthew Scarborough, Stellar Vision, Ariana McCarthy, Daniel Sutton, Ants Are Still Running the World, Coulter Smith, Tom Groh, Val 9000, Jenna Tal, Quiet 185, Anna Loves Riley, Riley and Anna, Omni, Poodlehawk, The Tim Caucus, Multimondi, Trevor Janis, Lemmy 101, Anthropophojak, Saren 42, Chronic to Hemphog, Catherine, Radical Maniac, Ramon Acosta, Incosin, Violent Orchard, Sophie Baby, Political Puppy, Andreas Chiringuito, Zach Christensen, Josh Mickelson, Todd Buckingham, and Todd Lajeunesse. We shall meet you in the tavern, and we raise a drink, and we salute you.